Hello everybody, welcome to today's webinar on woodland creation and protecting the historic environment. My name's Ceri Rutter and I'm a business development advisor for the Forestry Commission in the Southwest. I think we'll make a start now. Today's presentation will be delivered by Ceri Rutter, who's our area team's historic environment advisor, but she'll be focusing on the Southwest historic environment. The event will be recorded and it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel in due course, and we'll also send out slides to the people who are attending. Please do use the Q&A function during the presentation and we'll attempt to answer questions as we go. There will be a delay before questions become visible, so please don't repeat the same question. We'll also have a question and answer session at the end, so people can ask us directly questions. If there are any questions we can't answer today, we will take them away and we'll answer them at a later date when we've got the information. Please be aware that there may be a short delay throughout the presentation. Now, without further ado, we'll make a start. Over to you, Ceri.
Hi, I'm Ceri Rutter, as Sarah said, Historic Environment Advisor for the Forestry Commission, supporting the Southwest area team. So the historic environment capacity in-house at Forestry Commission has grown quite rapidly recently, and we've doubled in number twice in the past few years. And we now have historic environment advisors in all area teams. Our job is to help advise the woodland officers on any historic environment issues that come up in their casework, be it woodland creation or management. And we're also starting to offer training both internally and externally, and that's why we're here today. So today we're going to focus on woodland creation, but I thought I'd start out giving you a quick background on what we mean by historic environment and how it's protected in England, and then I'll go through the historic environment chapter of the UKFS, a special focus on the guidelines that are relevant to woodland creation. Then I'll go on to discuss heritage data, so different sources of evidence that we use in archaeology and how we can find out what might be on your land. And finally, I'll try and bring this all together and talk about how you can incorporate historic features into your schemes. At the end, as Sarah said, we'll have a few questions, but if anything springs to mind as we go along, just pop your question in the Q&A section and we'll pick it up at the end. Okay. So, historic environment. What is it and how is it protected? So this is how the historic environment is defined in the National Planning Policy Framework. All aspects of the environment resulting from the interaction between people and places through time, including all surviving physical remains of past human activity, whether visible, buried or submerged, and landscaped and planted or managed flora. Well, pretty broad description, right? So necessarily so, because we live on an island that's been densely populated for many thousands of years. So evidence of human interaction with the environment is everywhere. Point to any landscape in the country and you'll see how humans have shaped it. Dig a hole in any field and there's a chance you might stumble upon an Iron Age roundhouse, a Roman road or an Anglo-Saxon burial. But what I like about this definition though is that it implies that the dichotomy between the natural environment and the historic environment is false. There's no part of the natural world in this part of the country especially that's there without the influence of humans. We've been shaping and reshaping everything around us for millennia, and the evidence is all around us in the form of buildings and ruined structures, earthworks, so lumps and bumps and hollows in the land, buried archaeological remains and objects, ancient woodlands and veteran trees, and then when you bring them all together, they create this kind of idea of a historic landscape character. And all of these clues of our past relationship with the landscape combine to help us write these complex intertwining stories of our collective past. By preserving what we can and trying to understand the evidence, it can provide a link to our past. This brings with it a sense of community cohesion, rootedness and connection with the land around us. If we feel connected to it, we're more likely to look after it. This is especially pertinent in current times as we learn a lot from the past about how to work with nature and the resilience required during times of change. Okay. So we've got a huge variety of historic environment evidence out there that we need to look after, but how is it protected? You may have come across the terms designated and non-designated assets before, but what do we mean by that? Well, designated assets are features, landscapes, buildings or monuments that are considered of national importance, and as such they've been put on a list and offered special protection. This table shows different types of designated heritage in the UK and how many of each of them can be found in the South West. So we've got World Heritage Sites, scheduled monuments, listed buildings, registered parks, registered battlefields and conservation areas. And I'm going to go through each one of these quickly in turn to give you a bit of background on each type. So first, World Heritage Sites. We've got 4 in the South West, 3 cultural that you can see pictured here on the bottom, and 1 natural, which is the Jurassic Coast. They are all places of universal value, as recognised under the terms of the 1972 World Heritage Convention. World Heritage Sites are managed by committees on behalf of UNESCO and all have an agreed management plan. In addition to this, Stonehenge also has a woodland management plan. The key thing about World Heritage Sites is this concept of outstanding universal value, or OUV you might have seen. It's defined for each World Heritage Site within their management plan, and anything that's deemed harmful to this value will be frowned upon. So for Stonehenge and Avebury, they're less keen on trees, as the outstanding universal value for this World Heritage Site includes this idea of a treeless, open grassland landscape where all of the different monuments are intervisible. Woodland creation within Stonehenge and Avebury World Heritage Site may subsequently be a little difficult. So woodland creation proposals within any World Heritage Site should notify the World Heritage Site Board to get their advice. So next are scheduled monuments. This started with the Ancient Monuments Protection Act of 1882, where listed archaeological sites that were deemed of national importance and worthy of protection by law. This original schedule contained 26 sites across England, and it's since grown every year. Of these 26 in the Southwest, there were originally 11, and this has increased to the nearly 7,000 that we have today. So these sites are now held under the Ancient Monuments and Archaeological Areas Act of 1979, and the schedule of monuments is kept by the Secretary of State for DCMS, but Historic England advised them on it, so they kind of work together on protection. Scheduled monument must meet a set definition of a monument as set out in the Act. It must be deemed of national importance. The schedule's by no means perfect. It can be a bit patchy in places, with some areas having slightly denser coverage than others. And today's sites are sometimes only scheduled when they're considered at risk. So if a site is well managed and not in danger, it might not be added, but this should not be taken as a reflection of its significance. Because the main thing to remember is that some sites that are of national significance and worthy of scheduling just aren't on the list yet, because they're not at risk. So what does this all mean for you in practice? Well, it's against the law to disturb a scheduled monument by carrying out works without consent, cause reckless or deliberate damage to a monument, or use a metal detector without a licence. And as for woodland creation, that means you can't plant, including restock, on a scheduled monument without consent. You can't run machinery over a scheduled monument where it disturbs the soil without consent. You should also consider setting of monuments. So this one, setting is a bit of a hard one to get your head around, but it basically relates to the surroundings of the monument and how it fits with other sites or the landscape around it. There's no sort of quick way to evaluate setting, and it must be considered on a case-by-case basis. So finally, you also must notify Historic England for advice on setting and if consent is required for your case. So if you've got a case within or near a scheduled monument, you should need to notify Historic England to find out if consent was required. Next, listed buildings. These originally came out of the Town and Country Planning Act of 1947, and we've now got over 90,000 listed buildings in the Southwest. They are everywhere. They're usually buildings, but can also be other built features like bridges or milestones, like you can see in the pictures. They come in 3 grades. The lowest grade is grade 2, and there's grade 2 star, and the slightly more important buildings are listed as grade 1. You can see by the percentages on the slide that the vast majority of listed buildings in the Southwest are the lowest grade, grade 2. What this means for woodland creation, a listed building may not be demolished, extended or altered without special permission from the local planning authority, who take their advice from Historic England. The setting of listed buildings is the issue that we mostly commonly come across in our work, as woodland creation around a building can change key views from it and how it looks and feels within the landscape, which may deem to have a negative impact. So if you have any listed buildings within or very close to a proposal, we might need to notify Historic England as well as the local authority. And if you're not sure if this is necessary or not, get in touch with the local woodland officer and they can check for you. So next, register parks and gardens. So design landscapes considered of national importance are included on the Register of Parks and Gardens of Special Historic Interest, which is maintained by Historic England on behalf of DCMS again. Emphasis on the register is on gardens, grounds and or other planned open spaces that form part of a designed landscape, rather than anything to do with planting or botanical importance. So like listed buildings, they come in 3 grades, grade 1 down to grade 2. And in the southwest, we have 306 registered parks and gardens, and of these, 58% are grade 2, so there's slightly more grade 2 star and grade 1 compared to the buildings. Registration on the list is a material consideration in the planning process, yet we're outside that. So for woodland creation, it can be difficult to create new woodland inside a registered park unless it was part of the original design and you're seeking to restore it. Species choice can also be an issue, but it all depends on the original design and the unique qualities of each park. We should always look for opportunities to improve and restore parks. Many have parkland plans, others have separate woodland management plans, many have nothing at all. Then you have to look at historic maps for clues to the original design. Each one's different, but these sort of documents might give clues onto the important features of the park and if there's any scope for any woodland creation within it. Again, any woodland creation schemes within a registered park need careful consideration, and Historic England should be notified for grade 1 or grade 2 parks, and the Gardens Trust should be notified for grade 2 star, and Gardens Trust should be notified for grade 2 parks. I'll summarise this later, so don't worry. Battlefields next, I'm rattling through. Battlefields have often been at the key turning points in English history, and the Register of Battlefields aims to protect the most significant through the planning system. We have 10 in the southwest, out of the 47 in the rest of England. Like registered parks, battlefields are a material consideration in the planning process. So planning authorities must consider the impact of any proposed development on the battlefield significance. So as for us, it usually comes down to a sense of place. The issue here, we need to think about how trees might impact important views across battlefields, key approaches and movements within them. So like any other designated heritage, settings should also be considered. And if you have a case within or adjacent to a registered battlefield, you need to notify Historic England and the Battlefields Trust. Okay, finally, our conservation areas, which are areas of special architectural or historic interest, and they're designated by the local planning authority under another act in 1990. Like parks and battlefields, there are extra planning controls and considerations in place to protect the historic and architectural elements which make these places special. Southwest has an awful lot. The top 3 local authorities with the most conservation areas in the whole of England are all in the southwest, so Wiltshire, Cornwall and Cotswolds. So what this means for us, well, trees are often key to what makes a place special, so they get extra protection within conservation areas. There are tree preservation orders and also additional rules on felling and pruning trees, and any tree work must get permission from the local planning authority 6 weeks in advance. So for woodland creation, the setting of conservation area may need to be considered, as well as key views into, out of and within the conservation area. Conservation area appraisals and management plans are often available online, and these can give clues as to what's important for each area. So when you have a case that's within or nearby a conservation area, again, it might be worth having a look for these documents. But you also need to notify the local authority conservation officer, and they will identify key issues for you. So I keep going on about notifying. Each designated asset is slightly different on who you need to consult. Let's not notify. Here is a summary table of who you need to talk to if you come across any designated sites within or near to your scheme. Historic England is the main one, and they have a generic email for Southwest. then the case gets sent to the relevant member of staff beyond that. And if you have any doubt who to contact and when, ask your woodland officer. They'll be able to let you know. Okay, so beyond these designated sites, there are a few lesser known historic environment protections that will hopefully be included in the new UKFS when it comes out. First, the 1857 Burial Act made it illegal to disturb a grave, and it doesn't matter how old it is. So if any human remains are found or there is a risk to disturbance of human remains, such as planting a tree on them, then an exhumation licence must be obtained from the Ministry of Justice, which sounds very official and complicated, but the first point of contact would always be the police, and they could guide you beyond that. Prehistoric barrows may still contain human remains, so if you have any on your land, they should be avoided for tree planting, as they may need a licence to plant. This photo is terrifying, and it shows a wind-thrown tree pulling apart a human burial. The vertebrae you can see up there, the red circle, and the rest of the body is down below. You can see the leg bones there, just highlighting the damage that trees can do. Secondly, is the law on fines. Under the 1996 Treasure Act, fines remain the property of the landowner unless they meet the definition of treasure set out in the Act. This definition usually includes the type of material it is, how old it is, and where it was found. Any potential treasure should be reported to the coroner within 14 days, and this can be done by your local fines liaison officer. Where fines are deemed treasure, museums have the opportunity to acquire it, and the landowner or the finder may be offered a reward. And if no museum wants it, then this is returned to the finder. It's illegal to not report treasure and can lead to a prison sentence. Although there's no legal obligation beyond that which is deemed treasure, it's good practice to report all fines with the local fines liaison officer, as they will be able to help you find out more about what you found and if you need to do anything else. The website to find your local officer is on the screen, but I've also got a document with it all in. I'll share with you later. Finally, are military aircraft crash sites, which are protected under the Military Remains Act of 1986. Again, you'll need a licence from the Ministry of Defence to plant near a military aircraft, so we need to stay well away. The issue with this one is that it's not often known where these sites are. Some information is held by the MOD and it's not freely available, and some is held with the local HERs, but it's sometimes hard to locate crash sites in order to avoid them. So a bit of a tricky one. Right, so that quick summary of the types of designated sites and legal protections. What about the rest of the stuff? What about all of the other historic features and sites that are not designated? These are protected in other ways, including in the planning system. So I'm not going to go into the ins and outs because it's not relevant, but archaeology is a material consideration in planning and must be considered in all planning applications. The local planning authority recommends what evaluation and mitigation work is required for an application, and a developer must pay for this work to gain planning permission. This could involve a desk-based assessment all the way up to surveys and full excavation, and reflects the often destructive nature of development. Sites can be destroyed by building, so they need to be fully investigated to assess the risk to the asset. This very cautious planning approach is also sometimes applied to forestry casework, and you may have come across local Historic Environment Service advice that seemed a bit over and above what you're expecting for woodland creation. But your woodland officer would always consider any advice received against the requirements and guidelines of the UKFS and select the most appropriate way forward. Which brings me neatly on to the UKFS. So first, bit of context. Latest version of the UKFS was published in 2017, and broadly speaking, it lays out the government's approach to sustainable forestry in the UK. It's available to read online, and you can see the link at the top of the slide here. It applies to all woodlands and forests. It outlines international agreements and conventions relating to forestry. Compliance with the UKFS is behind all of our regulations, incentives and monitoring, and we follow it as written. But there are some guidelines which may be open to some interpretation. Because of this, we're writing some more detailed supplementary guidance notes to be published on the .gov website later this year. The UKFS defines what must be done, so the legal requirements, what should be done, the good forestry practice requirements, and beyond these are provided more detailed guidelines for forest and woodland managers to follow to meet sustainable forestry objectives of the UKFS. It underwent a review at the end of last year, and the new version is due to be published later this year. We keep hearing any day now, but nothing yet, which might lead to some slight tweaks in the wording, but we don't anticipate any major changes for the historic environment chapter. Speaking of which, as you may know, the UKFS is made up of 7 chapters. Historic environment is just one of these, and they all sort of overlap and complement each other. In some instances, specific guidance note is cross-referenced with one in another chapter, so they kind of all work together. At first glance, these chapters can seem a bit wordly, but on closer inspection, they're pretty well structured, and each chapter is broken down into subsections. There's typically an introduction and policy summary, and then it goes on to click on the requirements and then the guidelines. Each requirement has a descriptive section, and then the requirement itself written next to a little numbered box. And after the requirements come the guidelines, and these are listed in a similar way. Now I'm going to go through a few of these, not the whole chapter. I'm pleased to hear that of particular relevance for woodland creation. So first is the legal requirements section. We've already gone through the historic environment legislation, and that also features in the UKFS. The requirements relating to scheduled monuments, archaeological finds and archaeological buildings, and listed buildings, I should say, are all laid out here and must be followed by law. So next come the good practice requirements. These are split into 2 sections, historic landscape and historic features. The historic landscape is given equal weight to individual historic features within it in the UKFS. And the first requirement is that forests be designed and managed to take account of the cultural values of the landscape. So as for historic features, it's a requirement that the woodland owners and managers find out about the historic features on the land and take advice from the local historic environment service. This is extremely important for all woodland creation, as they're the local experts and hold the most up-to-date information. And you're going to hear me say that a lot today, I'm afraid. So right, beyond the requirements are the guidelines. These are split into 8 subsections that you can see here, and spread across these are the 30 guidelines overall. So I'm going to summarise the main ones that relate to woodland creation now. So first up are 3 guidelines relating to historic context, which are intended to provide a starting point in forest planning for historic environment. These guidelines cross-reference with the landscape chapter to a degree, as you can see by the little green numbers at the end. Again, the importance of contacting the local historic environment service is emphasised, as is the use of historic landscape characterisation where available. It's a mouthful. Woodland managers are encouraged to consider the impacts of forestry on the historic context and landscape character, and also encouraged to consider opportunities to complement or recreate landscapes of historic interest. This could be to restore lost woodland or recreate tree cover from historic designed landscape. So next up are the guidelines relating to evidence of the historic environment, as assessing the evidence is vital in establishing the historic environment value of a site. Once again, the importance of the local historic environment service is emphasised, as well as ground truthing. This guideline goes on to say you should commission specialist surveys where evidence is significant, which is one of the most contentious phrases in the whole chapter. Now, what is considered significant evidence may seem a little opaque, but we are writing guidance again on the types of survey and when they might be required, and it will be published later this year. Your local historic environment service may advise you on the need for a survey, but if you're in any doubt, again, contact your woodland officer. Another good guideline relates to long established boundaries, banks and veteran trees, and promotes these as being included as features to be protected. So for woodland creation, these sort of historic boundaries can often be worked around by leaving them in managed open space. And final guideline encourages the sharing of information gathered from these sort of surveys with the local historic environment record to expand their record. Okay, the next section relates to forest planning, and the first guideline requests that the considerations of the historic environment are fully integrated into the forest planning process. The next one discusses the use of open space around features of historic significance. So for scheduled monuments, it recommends at least 20 metres, yet the buffer of open space may be less for other types of feature. Again, we hope to publish further guidance on this later in the year. Consideration should also be given to setting of historic features, as they can often be understood more fully when appreciated within their historic landscape context. Forest planning guidelines go on to suggest that where there is archaeological potential but there is limited evidence, you could restrict the proposed species to shallow-rooted trees and shrubs only to minimise ground disturbance by tree roots. Now, research conducted by Peter Crowe at Forest Research can inform decision-making on which species are suitable on a given site. The research demonstrated that root depth is in many ways as dependent upon the soil type and hydrology as it is on the choice of tree species. So again, I can put this report in the chat for you to have a look at later, if you find that useful. The next possibility of considering restoring tree cover on previously wooded sites is discussed, and the use of historic maps is invaluable in this. I'll talk about this later. Lastly, short rotation forestry and coppice crops are mentioned as that care should be taken to avoid sites of historic interest where these are proposed due to the high risk of regular soil disturbance on these sort of sites. Okay, so the next section relates to forest operations, as this can lead to ground disturbance, as heavy machinery involved has the potential to seriously damage historic features. Although this is obviously more relevant for woodland management than creation, if machinery is to be used for planting, how it moves within the woods needs to be considered carefully to avoid ground disturbance. If operations are planned on or near a feature that's scheduled, then there's a reminder guideline that Historic England need to be consulted before work can commence. If features are unscheduled, then advice from the local Historic Environment Service should be sought. The next section is hydrology. Many buried archaeological features survive well in waterlogged soils, and altering the hydrology of a site can affect their preservation. So this guideline requests that historic environment is considered when making changes to drainage systems when planting new trees. The last section you'll be pleased to hear is access and interpretation. The historic environment provides considerable public benefit and enjoyment. It provides time depth to landscape as well as contribute to a sense of place. This one requests that you consider providing information and or public access when you have an interesting historic feature on your land. By providing access and interpretation, it can deliver a focus to the woodland and greatly enhance the visitor experience. It's another one to think about. Okay, so in summary, for woodland creation, the overarching UKFS approach is to avoid all known significant historic assets and work around them in order to protect them. The standard requires woodland creation schemes to identify, protect and manage historic features, whilst also considering the impact of new woodland on the wider historic landscape, character and setting of significant features. Protection to significant features would normally be provided by leaving them in an appropriate area of open space. And you need to take advice from local Historic Environment Service and check historic environment records for all schemes. If you have significant evidence of historic features but don't know their extent in order to avoid them, then specialist surveys can be commissioned to provide the information that's needed. Likewise, if there's archaeological potential but there's limited evidence, you can restrict proposed species to shallow-rooted trees and shrubs only to minimise ground disturbance posed by tree roots. So all applications for our grants and regulations, from felling licences and EIA to UK, need to be UKFS compliant. They need to follow these guidelines before we can improve them. So it's a good idea to get your head around them before compiling a woodland creation scheme. We have a great, did have a case recently where an individual bought land in order to create legacy woodland, yet there was a deserted medieval village across a large part of the land. So in the end, woodland creation was somewhat limited. Had they checked for historic environment features before they made the purchase, they might have looked elsewhere and saved themselves a lot of disappointment. So my plea is do the checks, but also check at the earliest opportunity. Okay, so next I'm rattling through again, but We'll get there. I'm going to go through the types of information we have to inform us about the historic environment and where you might be able to find them. So we've covered what we mean by historic environment and also how evidence of the past is protected. But what sort of evidence are we talking about, and how can you find out what might be on your land? Well, in archaeology, we use a lot of different sources of information to piece together the narrative of what a place was like in the past and how the land use has changed over time. We use crop marks. These can be sometimes be seen on the ground, but usually identified on aerial photos. I'll talk about those more in a sec. We also look at earthworks, sort of the lumps and bumps on the ground, which can often be seen. They also can be seen on aerial photos and LiDAR. The most invasive and informative evidence comes from excavation, where we methodically dig up features and remove and analyse the remains. This is quite a time-consuming and expensive process, but it does provide the most detailed information about a site. A good way of looking below the surface is through geophysics. This enables you to look below for below-ground features. It's non-invasive and much cheaper than excavation. I'm not going to go into how it works now, but think of it a bit like an X-ray, enabling you to see features below the ground surface. We can also get information from individual finds, so things that people find on the ground, such as metalwork or pottery. High density of finds on the ground can indicate further buried remains below that have been disturbed by recent land use, usually ploughing. Another thing we look at are historic maps, plans and images. These can give us clues on land use change and how the landscape once looked. I'll tell you where you can access those in a bit. And finally, we also think about place names. The name of a settlement, field or hill can give us clues as to their origin. You can tell if a settlement is a Saxon or Roman origins just from its name quite often. So all of this information is gathered, but where does it all end up? Well, ideally, information will end up on the local historic environment record that's maintained by the local planning authority. We call it the HER. The thing to remember about HERs is that they're a work in progress. Information is added all the time, and the density of information on them can reflect the amount of development that has gone on in a given area. So if there's nothing on the HER for a site, it doesn't mean there's nothing there. It just could be, there still could be potential for unknown remains. Each HER has slightly differently run, and I'll talk about them in the southwest in a minute. So firstly, go back to the crop marks. For woodland creation, I just thought I'd highlight a few of these evidence types that are most relevant. We'll start with the crop marks, and I love a cross section. The one at the bottom here shows how fields can develop lush marks. So these where the crop has grown tall, where the soil is deeper below because there used to be a ditch and the crop is above is darker, and parch marks where there's likely some built remains close to the surface, so the crop doesn't have enough moisture or nutrients to thrive, and this makes growth above stunted and pale. So when we look at aerial photos, we can identify linear features, enclosures, settlement sites and loads more simply by observing how the grass or crop above it grows. It often depends on the type of crop and the time of year as to whether there'll be anything visible, and they're sometimes easier to see following dry periods in the summer. The images on the top here are taken from a Guardian article about all of the new features that were discovered following the drought in 2018. Last year's drought also led to many new discoveries. And other than these chance finds, there's also been a number of systematic surveys of crop marks across England as part of the National Mapping Programme, or NMP, from Historic England. The NMP is patchy and not all of the country has been covered. So if there's nothing recorded, it doesn't mean there's nothing there, or that it might not show up in the future and under the right conditions. And some soils are more suited to crop marks than others, depending on their nutrient and water content and drainage, things like that. The results of these surveys can be seen on Historic England's aerial archaeology viewer, which again I will go through in a sec. So here's an Historic England aerial photo that shows the land adjacent to a recent woodland creation planning grant case in Gloucestershire. You can see there's a potential Roman enclosure, this rectangular shape here, that grazes the woodland creation planning grant boundary, so it was all down here and the enclosure sort of hits it slightly there. And there's also a likely prehistoric settlement here too, which is harder to see on this photo, but trust me, there's a lot going on. The areas of longer grass are not going to be planted, so this bit down here is now decided it's not going to be planted, so it's not of concern about the enclosure anymore because it's been given a wide area of open space. I just thought I'd include a real example of the sort of evidence that that comes across our desks. And if this field, the wider field here, if this was part of a woodland creation planning grant case, then we would recommend a survey, a geophysical survey, in order to inform decision on which areas should be avoided for planting. Okay, one problem with aerial photos though is that you can't see through trees. Where there is tree cover, you will not spot any crop marks or earthworks. So here you can see a rather colourful mosaic of different woodland, and you have no idea what's lurking within. That's where the LiDAR comes in. So if you watch the middle of this photo and then you look at the LiDAR, you can now see the distinctive earthwork banks of Welshbury Hill Fort in Gloucestershire. You can also see the shape of the historic field boundaries to the east and south of it as well. It's quite interesting. So a bit of background on LiDAR. It stands for light detection and ranging. It's made by using lasers mounted on either a plane or a drone that targets the ground and measures the time it takes for the light to be reflected back. As for seeing through trees, when a survey is undertaken in winter, there are less leaves to deal with. Some of the pulses make it right through the branches and hit the ground before they're reflected back. By sending many pulses a second, it gradually builds a picture of the points on the surface below, and this raw data, or point clouds they're called, can be processed to create a variety of models of the ground surface. So lots of people are using these now to spot features on maps on a large scale. So the Chilterns AONB recently found thousands of sites this way. I understand Cranbourne Chase are now undergoing a similar project. So so LiDAR data has therefore been a bit of a game changer for historic environment applications. And now the Environment Agency has made full coverage of their 50 centimetres to 1 metre resolution data available for the whole of England. It will probably find more sites. So here is the coverage of the EA LiDAR in South West. As you can see, it's pretty complete. When you zoom in, you get a lot of detail, like this lovely beauty, Maiden Castle in Hillfort, Dorset. Sometimes earthworks are not very visible on the ground due to vegetation cover, and LiDAR can help give a wider perspective, and you can follow large features over wide areas, even when they're quite hard to see on the ground. And that enables us to manage known sites better, so we can map sites more easily and plan around them. I'll show you we can access LiDAR in a bit. Another source of information comes from historic maps. We're very lucky to have amazingly accurate mapping from the Ordnance Survey dating back 150 years. First edition came out in the 1880s or 1890s, with further editions ever since. We also have fairly good coverage of tithe maps dating back to the 1840s available in the southwest. These are available online on the online HER maps in Somerset and Devon, and can provide useful information on past land use. Here you can see Welshbury Hill Fort again, and it shows that the woodland on the Hill Fort has been there since at least the 19th century, where the map was produced. So basically, we're often comparing all of these different sorts of information. We've got photos, maps and LiDAR to build a picture of what is there now and what was there in the past. So we know how archaeologists find new sites and features. What we use for clues, but how do you find out about sites that have already been identified? Well, there's a wealth of free online resources that provide a starting point to understanding what historic features might be lurking around a site. The resources on screen are what I refer to when I'm giving advice. I don't have the full data that's held by the local authority HER, but you can get a basic indication of potential historic environment issues within a site by checking these. I would stress again that HER contact is still key, as they hold the most detailed information and have the local knowledge and experience we need, and the UKFS requires to progress most of our casework. I'll just put a document in the chat. Hopefully this will work. It's got links to all of these sites, so you can open them while I go through each one to make sure it makes more sense when you start playing with them. I'll go through each one in turn. Okay, Okay, so first, for the designated heritage assets, we've got a few sites that you could check. Firstly, Magic, which you may be familiar with, as you're probably using it to check for other layers anyway. The other one is Historic England's online map of the list, which contains the same information. It's just a sort of preferences which site you find easier to navigate. With either of these sites, when you click on the feature on the map, a box will open with a link to the Historic England list entry where you'll find a description, a map, and maybe even photos. The amount of information in here varies a lot, but it can be really useful, especially for registered parks. Now, to find out about the non-designated heritage, we have no reliable, consistent source of information yet, like we do for the designated sites. Instead, we need to turn to our local authorities, as they each manage the local historic environment record, and these are the primary source of information for planning, development control and land management. Some of this information is available online, not all of it, and that's why it's a requirement of the UKFS for applications to contact them to ensure that they get the full picture. Fortunately for us in South West, if you want to get an initial idea of what might be within your proposal area, then we have great coverage of HERs online. The only area in the South West that doesn't have an online map is Plymouth. The dotty areas on the map are HERs that have an online map, and the dark green ones are also on another online map, the Heritage Gateway, which I'll come on to in a bit. I should emphasise again that although I keep saying HERs are online, what is available online might be a subset of the whole HER. And certain information may be held back, such as sort of fines for metal detecting and all sorts of other things. So we should always be aware when looking at these online maps that there might be more information held back by the local authority, so you still need to get in touch with them. Here are the HERs and a link to their websites. Hopefully you can access. I'm not sure if you can access it, hopefully. As you can see, some of these don't have their own online map, but instead on a website called Know Your Place, which I'll come to next. Overall, these maps are easy to use and contain all of the designated layers, as well as the HER, historic landscape character, conservation areas, and often many other layers that might be of interest. Wiltshire's site is point data only, but the others also show line and polygon data, which may enable you to see the extent of the feature described in the record. So yeah, Know Your Place. It was set up by Bristol Council, and the surrounding local authorities are gradually joined into. It's a live stream of HER data from each local authority that takes part. So they don't have the same currency issues that you might get with other websites. It now covers the whole of the South West, apart from Exmoor, Cornwall and Dorset. It's easy to use. You go to the main website up here, you select your local authority, and then it'll open the map. You'll then see a list of the layers available on the right here. And it splits the screen, so you can change the background and everything within each screen, and you can move it this bar backwards and forwards to make one bigger than the other. The base maps can be changed up here, so you can have various historic maps or modern maps or aerial photos. Another thing to remember about this site is that it shows the polygon data for Wiltshire, which is missing from their HER online map. Also, Gloucestershire and South Gloss are on here, and they don't have separate online HER maps, so that's really useful. One great thing about this website is that when you use it on your phone, it geolocates. So if you're on site and you want to know if anything's recorded, providing you have a signal, the map will zoom to where you are and you'll be able to browse the records in the field because it will know where you are. This is also the case for the online HERs for Devon and Dorset, and I find it really useful. Heritage Gateway next. This one was put together by Historic England. We're working on a refresh at the moment, which is due out next year, which is great to hear because it's currently a bit clunky. It does crash sometimes, but it does cover most of the country, and in that sense it can provide some consistency. Some areas are not mapped, and you only get a list of potential features with grid references, for example in Gloucestershire, but others are mapped as polygons showing the extent of features, which can be more helpful. As with other websites I've gone through, it's not an up-to-date data set, not at all. Some areas are only updated annually, and it's certainly only part of the full HER, so shouldn't be relied upon to base decisions upon, because the local HER should still be approached to get the full picture. Next, back to one of my favourites, the National Library of Scotland's side-by-side viewer. Here you can compare historic OS maps with modern maps, aerial photos, and crucially the EA LiDAR. You can change the map you see on each side from the drop-down list down here. And you can move the cursor on one map, it mirrors the cursor on the other map, so you know exactly where you are. This is an invaluable resource to look at past land use, relict field boundaries, potential sites and buildings, settlements, and also historic parkland and design landscapes. Here you can see first edition OS map on the left from the 1890s, as well as recent aerial photo showing the Neolithic and Bronze Age features within a plantation on Dartmoor that are now managed within open space. It's well designed and easy to use site, but be warned, you can go down a complete wormhole with it and lose hours of your life. Here's another example of how you can compare different images. In this case, it's Welshbury Hill Fort again, showing how you can look at the LiDAR and the aerial photos at the same time. It's an easy way of accessing LiDAR. There are a few other websites online that have good coverage, but alternatively, if you're a GIS whiz, you can download tiles directly from the Environment Agency website and process them as you see fit. Or you can stream them if you're using Esri software. Another good source of aerial photos is Google Earth Pro. If you download it to your computer, you can switch on the historic imagery button that you can see at the top here. Then it opens up a sort of timeline. You can scroll backwards and forwards within it to see aerial photos going back to the 1940s in some cases, although most date from the late 20th century. Flicking through these images can give you an insight into recent land use, for example, if a site has been quarried or how heavily ploughed it might be. You can also spot crop marks in some areas. Earthworks are also visible if the sunlight is at an oblique angle, for instance in winter. Here we can see Clay Hill, a hill fort in Wiltshire, with a couple of Bronze Age barrows on the summit of the hill. The first image shows fairly flat surface when the sun is high in the sky, and the second image shows the difference oblique light can make, and the barrows just pop out. You can see on there. Another use is when thinking about the wider landscape and how woodland creation proposal might fit within it. This image shows a planning grant case in Exmoor from last year that was downslope from a scheduled hill fort. You can see at the bottom here. By mapping the proposal area, and you can spin around the map and you can get a rough initial idea of how it might look within the landscape. Next comes historic landscape characterisation. I'm not going to get into the ins and outs of this, but just be aware that there are two main types. The first one is the coarse grain national level map that's available on the Magic website. It's great in that it's consistent across the country, but it doesn't provide much detail or time depth. The second type is the finer grained local historic landscape characterisation that basically classifies each field. Obviously, there's potentially much more detail in there, but they do vary in quality and usefulness across the southwest, and some are not available at all. They're generally available to view on each local authority HER map that I went through earlier. You can see Devon's on the screen here. A good HLC will give you an insight into how old the enclosures might be, what they were before they were enclosed, and any sort of past land use, for example, orchards, rough ground and quarries would all be classified differently and given different dates. Historic landscape characterisation is often a good place to start when looking at a site, because it can give you a sort of broad insight into the landscape in question, how it is developed. You can then go on to consider the impact of introducing new trees into this landscape. So the next are two Historic England viewers that came out last year. The first is the Aerial Archaeology Mapping Explorer that shows the crop marks and earthworks that have been recorded as part of the National Mapping Programme that I mentioned earlier, as well as many smaller targeted aerial surveys across the country. You can see the coverage across the southwest and the map in the corner here, so there are quite major gaps in it. But when you zoom in, and you can get a fair amount of detail in this one, and areas where local HER may only provide like a big polygon or a dot on the map, you can see quite all of the detail. And if you click on each feature, it will say what it's thought it to be and a link to more information where it's available. Some areas it also distinguishes between crop marks, banks, ditches and areas of ridge and furrows. You can see on the key on the right, so ridge and furrows is pale blue and it shows the direction of the ridges, and then we've got banks that are dark red and ditches are dark green. Again, with this one, you can lose hours of your life, but it's a lot of fun. The next one is the Aerial Photo Explorer, which makes available a huge chunk of Historic England aerial photo archive. Some photos are vertical, so from above, and some are oblique, so they're from an angle, and they date back to the 1930s in some areas. They're usually concentrations of photos around scheduled monuments generally. Some areas have not been flown yet, so it's a bit patchy, as you can see from the coverage map at the bottom here. And the darker areas depicting areas with high concentration of aerial photos. And you can see the darkest ones are Stonehenge here and Avebury there. It can be handy to look at these when you're looking for crop marks and past land use on a site. It works like all other online maps. You can zoom into the area you're interested in, click on the map and get a link to the photo you want to look at. So finally, I thought I'd touch on a project that we're working on in-house that's come out of the England Tree Action Plan Action 4.6, which hopes to make accessing information to the historic environment for woodland creation easier. The project hopes to increase confidence and certainty for woodland creation proposers, leading to faster assessment of proposals, which will support delivery against the government's ambitious woodland creation targets. Access to historic environment information has been identified as a barrier to woodland creation, holds things up. And it's hoped this project will help with that, which will in turn improve our customer service and reduce the number of inappropriate proposals, with features being picked up early and worked around. So it's very early days, but the three main outputs at the moment can be seen here. So many of you will be familiar with the SHINE dataset, which is used as part of countryside stewardship. And we're currently working with local authorities to adapt this dataset model to make it suitable for woodland creation proposals. We're hoping that the data will eventually be freely available through an online portal, but again, it's very early days, so I can't give much more detail at this stage. We will also create a historic environment targeting or opportunity map that will highlight areas that may be suitable for woodland creation, as well as updating our current woodland creation sensitivity map to include more historic environment information, because currently it only takes account of scheduled monuments and nothing else. The project will be running until March 2025, and nearer to launch we'll run a series of training and webinars to help tell everyone more about it, so watch the space. We're really hoping that it helps you all out. Okay, so for now, before these data sets are available, how can you design a scheme around the historic environment? Where do you start? So I've talked about heritage protection in England. We've gone through UKFS. But a look at the different websites you can use to find out historic environment features. But what are the key points to remember for your schemes? Well, firstly, I can't emphasise enough the value in checking for historic environment issues early on when designing a scheme. As I keep mentioning, you must also contact the local historic environment service as part of your application. They sometimes charge for this service to cover their costs, but this varies from area to area and the cost is often minimal in the overall scheme of a grant application. If you've done your own preliminary checks on the websites I mentioned beforehand, you might minimise potential issues or surprises that might arise when you contact them as well. Lastly, you should notify the relevant authorities when you have a designated feature within or very nearby to your proposal. So once you've done your initial checks, you've got your HER information and advice back, and you've got information from the designated heritage features on your proposal. So now you're thoroughly confused on what to do next. But the thing to remember here is that there's often more than one UKFS compliant way forward for a case, especially when you have gathered information from multiple people. Compromise is often possible, and through creative design, incorporating areas of open space and considering species choice in sensitive areas, the historic environment can more often than not be worked around. And certain features may even be better protected in open space within managed woodland, especially if they were previously arable. Woodland officers take all of the information for each case on board and make the final call on which approach is most appropriate within the overall scheme of the proposal. That's within the parameters of the UKFS. So if you get a very cautious response from a local historic environment service, don't despair, as in some cases there still might be a creative workaround. Common concerns we come across from local authorities include requests to exclude large areas on the basis of limited available information, or it could be to exclude areas of 19th century ridge and furrow, or quite often we have requests for a need for a geophysical survey in areas that have limited evidence. I'm sure a lot of these will be familiar to a lot of you. Speaking of surveys, in some cases we genuinely don't have enough information to make a judgment on the best way forward. For example, if we have significant evidence that they're important historic features within a proposal, but we don't know their exact extent, we would recommend a survey. Obviously, these come at a cost, but under the Woodland Creation Planning Grant, 70% of the cost of these is covered. For smaller projects, this cost could make all the difference between whether a scheme is viable or not. It's a difficult decision, as a survey may result in very little of the land being plantable if the results show important remains. But the land in question cannot be planted without a survey, as there would have to be significant evidence there to require a survey in the first place. So it's a delicate balance. So one example of this would be the field that we saw earlier with the crop marks around it. Some of the field might be plantable, but there's definitely archaeology there, so some will need to be excluded. And as always, the choice over whether a survey might be cost effective or not is made on a case-by-case basis and balanced against the scale of the proposal as a whole. To an outsider, these decisions might sound a bit subjective, but behind the scenes they're much more structured than they seem. And any difficult cases we come across, we discuss as a team until we agree on the best way forward. And we will only recommend a survey as a last resort set against the scale of the proposal when no other way is possible. If we decide that a further survey is appropriate, then we've written a series of briefs that you can use to approach consultants. The Woodland Officer can provide you with these. Under the Woodland Creation Planning Grant, we can only accept quotes that follow our latest brief. So it's really important that you use one of these when commissioning a survey, or we won't be able to help you pay for it. So once you have all your information, you're ready to start designing your woodland. Crudely, this is not what we want to do. I've had some fun with clip art. Planting on buried remains. Instead, we're all about avoiding features here. This is not planning, so they're not the funds to investigate every site fully, so we work around known features. To do this, we recommend placing significant features within open space in your proposals and give an appropriate buffer around them before you plant any trees to minimise potential tree root damage. For scheduled monuments, this will be 20 metres, but for historic field boundaries, this could be 5 metres. And these decisions are made on a case-by-case basis, and we need to take account of the nature and condition of features as well as their local significance. So please also try and think about beyond the individual features and about how your scheme might fit within the wider historic landscape. If it's an area of farmland with distinct intact medieval field boundaries and there's ridge and furrow earthworks and it's all associated with a medieval settlement, then large-scale productive woodland creation might not be appropriate. But on the flip side, if it's an area that was once wooded, as shown on tithe maps or the first edition OS maps, then there might be an opportunity for woodland creation to restore this historic landscape. Finally, you should also think about the woodland creation on the setting of individual features. So particular types of site to look out for on this one are those that have a visual aspect to their function. So for example, a hill fort or the Bronze Age barrows you can see here, they were both located in areas where they could be seen from a long way off. So placing trees right up to them would interrupt their visibility within the landscape, making it harder to understand the feature and why it was constructed where it was. It's not the end of the world if you had such a feature on your land, but they might need a wider area of open space to retain key views from and to them. So hopefully it's given you some idea of thought processes that go on behind the scenes and how we make decisions on how make the decisions we do about the suitability of woodland creation schemes. Well, as we're all more than aware, we're in a climate emergency and a biodiversity crisis, and woodland creation has a big role to play in this. So it must be very frustrating when you're told you can't plant where you want to because there's a deserted medieval village under your field, or you have a crop mark that indicates potential prehistoric enclosure and you've been asked to commission a geophysical survey. We totally understand, but please remember that historic environment is one of 7 elements of the UKFS that we must follow. and each bringing its own conditions in terms of woodland creation, and each have an equal footing. There's no hierarchy. Compliance with all of them enables us to ensure that the right tree is planted in the right place, and that's what we're aiming for. That's the end of my ramblings. So it's now time for some questions. But if something comes to mind later, don't worry, you haven't missed a chance. I've put a couple of email addresses on here. You can, if you take a note of these, you can send a query later on. The first one is generic woodland creation questions in the Southwest, and for the wider historic environment questions across the country, you can use the second email, and the relevant historic environment advisor from your area will pick that up. So over to Sarah if there's any questions.
So the first question that we've got is ridge and furrow is often a historical feature that comes up in the Southwest. I have found that the HE service often just flags this as a historical feature and recommend against tree planting. Please could you talk about planting on ridge and furrow and when and how you can do it, and how to discuss this with the county archaeologist?
I had a feeling this one will come up. We have set criteria in-house that have developed over time for different types of ridge and furrow and when it might be suitable to plant. So generally, the 19th century, more recent ridge and furrow, which is it's much narrower, it's very straight, can be suitable to plant following recording, and recording could be sort of be preservation by record essentially. That LiDAR data could be enough for that because it's so good now that we can map straight from it. But the medieval ridge and furrow is more rare, and it's slightly more problematic to plant. If it's not in good condition, and it's not associated with a medieval settlement and it's not part of a wider medieval landscape, then again that might be suitable to plant. But we're generally looking for the local significance and the condition of the feature. So there are situations where it might be possible to plant on ridge and furrow, but it's all to do with lots of different elements within the local landscape. So, but I'm happy to have that conversation if you have a specific instance. I can go through the case, and I can certainly help you talk to the local authority if we believe it is suitable to plant. I can help you have that conversation. Does that answer your question? I'm not sure. It's very strange not being able to see anyone. Yeah, like I say before, if anything springs to mind later on, just send us an email. We're happy to have a look. And usually I will give you a generic, like case by case basis type response. So if you have any specific instances that you'd like me to look at, I'm more than happy to do so. So just let me know.
So another one that we've had in is what is the guidance for the management of HE for sites where they have already been damaged by previous ploughing, etc.? Is it just a case of working from what you know, even though previous damage has been done with the management of the site? Do you manage it under these standards now? I would presume yes, but just wanted to confirm.
I think you lost me halfway through there. Is that written down?
What is the guidance for the management of HE for sites where they have already been damaged by previous ploughing, etc.? Is it just a case of can you see it now?
Yeah.
Working from
yeah, when we always take account of the current condition of a site and its local significance and rarity. So if even if it is slightly damaged by ploughing, if it is a very rare feature and it is deemed to be of local or potentially national significance, then we would still look to preserve it and place it within open space. If it is a site, what did we have recently? We had a few medieval lynchets on a site where they weren't very well preserved, and that's the sort of feature that is preserved quite well within woodland. So woodland creation went ahead on that one without any open space. But again, it depends on the type of feature and the condition and the local significance. I don't know, hopefully that helps.
Thanks, Ceri. Should I go to the next question?
Yeah.
So just going back. So it's part question, part observation. Do we need to reassess the significance of features and of protecting every feature given the climate and biodiversity crisis? This sometimes excludes large areas when the features are not necessarily going to provide any benefits at all. Woodland can also protect old features. I've seen countless old walls in mature woodland that have been flattened by now, had they not been in a woodland.
Yeah, this is a tricky one, isn't it? I completely agree that some features, we have to balance everything up, the significance of features against what we're dealing with globally. But again, we are following the UKFS as it is written, and we didn't write it. So we will always try and balance, take these decisions in a broader context, and we're balancing it against the needs of ecology and everything else as well. So the woodland officer will always make a decision on the round. But again, certain types of feature may be suitable to plant, yeah, if they're deemed of less significance.
Great, thank you, Ceri. On to the next question. Our local authority, Cornwall, has just introduced fees. I believe it will now cost £300 for inquiries. I work on a lot of small, less than kind of 0.5 hectare woodland creation sites that have non-designated features. I can see this cost being very off-putting. Can you offer any advice or workarounds?
I know there is consideration in-house on whether we can help within our grants, try and help with the costs of local authorities' fees. It's a possibility it might come into future planning grant schemes. It's just something that's been talked about at the moment. Beyond that, there's also our new data project. We'll have a completely different system at that point, and fees we're trying to start. We will probably, as countryside stewardship is as well, we will be standardising fees, so there'll be sounds much lower than £300. Standardising fees across the country so that everyone's sort of in the same boat to access the data and get the advice you need. At the moment, we are aware, and it's something we're working on. That's all I can say really at this point. There are various ways that we're trying to help in the future, particularly with I can totally understand that the smaller schemes, it makes them not viable in some areas. But we are trying to include that within our grants in the future to take that into account so that we can get some more smaller schemes through.
Brilliant, thank you, Ceri. On to the next question. I'm not sure if this is a question or a statement, but I'll read it out. It says, you mentioned several times the original Ordnance Survey as being in the late 19th century. I don't know if that's a question around that or query.
Yeah, the first edition, they were surveyed in the late 19th century, and they usually came out in the 1880s or 1890s. They were published across the country, so slightly different across the whole country as they worked their way around, all the surveyors. But that was the sort of time that they were published. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Next question. Do you have contact details for the WHS Partnership Board, the Local Gardens Trust and the Battlefields Trust?
Yeah, if you go to the I don't know if that document I put together, did you manage to put that out in the
we can't unfortunately send the documents out, but we will send
Okay.
it round with the kind of notes of the meeting, the presentation
Right.
slides, and we'll send that out with that.
I've produced a document that's got links to all of the websites I've talked about, and all of the contact details for everything you've just asked for, apart from the World Heritage Site boards. But they can be, I think they can be easily searched for through the UNESCO site. So I'm not sure. I might have put it in the document. I can't actually remember now because I did it quite late on Friday. So if it's not on there, I will add it certainly. And Jodie and crew will send it out after the webinar.
Lovely, thank you, Ceri. That would be great. I think there's a question here. Can you please give some evidence on when features have been better protected by open spaces in woodland as opposed to arable?
Well, okay. I could show you some maps where we've got features of like certain types of earthwork that a linear earthwork that goes through several fields. One field's got is wooded, one field has been ploughed, and the earthwork is preserved very well within the woods. If the open space is managed, then it will be preserved even better because it won't have root damage from the trees, but it also won't be ploughed, so they won't have any soil disturbance. I can't show you a map now, but I've seen many instances of this through the casework that comes across my desk. So it's quite dramatic when you look at the LiDAR and you can see sort of earthworks just stop when you get to an arable field, and they're essentially flattened. So that's what we're trying to avoid.
Thank you, Ceri. There is a comment that's been made as well. So the comment is, woodland officers can make decisions on balance whether issues are not a rigid barrier or covered by, I think that's statute. So it is not always black and white. As Ceri said, discuss with your local Forestry Commission woodland officer. And it just says, in terms of the historic OS maps, the Series 1 is available on the Scottish National Library website, which dates from the 1850s and on to the 1800s. So that was just a comment there.
Yeah, it's brilliant. The yeah, I went through that, the side-by-side map earlier. It's there's all sorts on there. When you delve deeper, there's many different types of map, and they're adding more all the time. So take a look.
Brilliant, thank you, Ceri. I think we've come to the end of our questions. Is there any other questions someone would like to pose before we draw the meeting to a close? Off. Any last questions at all? No, I think we've covered all of those. Sarah, I don't know if your mic's working, but I can hand back over to you to wrap up the webinar. If it's all systems go your end. Brilliant. I'm just going to hand you back to Sarah. Thank you.
So thank you everyone for attending the webinar. I hope you found it interesting and useful. As I said, it will be recording and it will be put on our YouTube channel in due course. We will also send out the slides and the document that Ceri tried to publish for you. Again, thanks for coming. Thanks for Ceri delivering the presentation, and without further ado, like to close the webinar. Thank you.